What is validation seeking? You've heard the term, of course, but you've also heard videos perhaps saying, stop seeking validation. But why then, too, in the movie Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins, did he say as a professor lecturing to the young students, we read to know that we are not alone? Or I might rephrase it now, finally, in my life, we read sometimes as a source of validation that we're not getting from any other source. Now here's my question I've had at least 5 years. Why do some people know exactly what their strengths are and consider them very plus point strengths, and others may have great attributes and question whether they have them? Indeed, some may wonder whether they're mentally sane or not, and yet be brilliant in terms of their IQ, insights, or maybe virtues. Indeed, there are many people who have great moral strength, great courage in that department, and then are called hotheads, or wingnuts, or radicals, or revolutionaries. Even, take it for what you will, Jesus was called a revolutionary in his time. Indeed, some of them may even be called grandiose, or narcissistic, or bipolar, or just plain full of it. Or perhaps also confusingly, masochistic for speaking out or doing something in support of their cause. Or as a female sometimes called a bitch. But indeed, in general, many people with the attributes we call virtuous or empathetic wonder whether that's even a good trait to have, and so they seek, all too often I believe, what you call validation. Why do such traits need validating and some other traits not? Now there's a book, for instance, I think the author's name, Kimberly Guilfoyle, a lawyer. She wrote something to the effect that you need to learn to advocate for your strengths. And in particular, maybe strengths that aren't quite apparent on the surface because maybe you came from a foreign country, and also maybe because you're female, and or particularly a mother. For instance, then she talks of how a female and a mother or caregiver needs to be able to articulate all the plus points of being a mother, and that it would be worth at least $100,000 if you could articulate it, that is the service you're providing as to the value at a minimum. Others have said, well, just in general, including a great sales expert, Marvin somebody or another, well, that again, the problem is we're talking about trying to quantify what's intangible. But is that the biggest of the problems then, as to why we seek validation in certain areas and not others, that it's something intangible versus tangible? Or is it more a matter then of what you might say the marshmallow test psychologists have done? Do you want one marshmallow now it's offered to the boy, or two later? Maybe it isn't as simple or as elegant as that. Maybe it's, do you want a bunch of marshmallows now, or do you want Fort Knox later, all the gold? Take two. There was a video for those who are spiritually or religiously inclined or what have you. T.D. Jakes gave a show a couple years ago talking of how he needed an operation. It might have been for his back, but he kept putting it off because he knew there would be a recovery time and period of pain. Hence the phrase to something to make the medicine go down. Or two, the phraseology, we know what we need to do. This might have been from T.D. Jakes again, or many others. We know what we need to do, but we don't do it. There's plenty of material on the internet and in books about how to do stuff, but do we want to do it? Yes, even the famous writer Aldous Huxley in Britain at one time, who wrote Brave New World, said one of the biggest problems he claimed, other than overpopulation, is that we want short-term pleasure rather than long-term gain, I guess you could say. We want it all now. In other words, hence fast food mentality to all of life, not just food. In fact, if you want to make money, I read a couple of years ago the best way to make it is to open up a restaurant. And if you're Mexican, oh, lo and behold, yes, let's go open up a new taco stand in the local parking lot. I say that jokingly and with respect. Incidentally, I did buy a burrito a couple weeks ago in a parking lot at a little, quote, burrito stand, and it cost $9 for the burrito and a $1 tip I gave also. Now, of course, I did get to have a beeper to put in my car as I parked next to it, and it went off, and then I got my burrito. But this is in one of the poorest states in the country. So has our country then become fast foodized and burritoized? I think so, in general. If you can't take a pill, I guess you're supposed to jump in a lake. There's no such thing as a long, slow grind to fixing things as a desired method, whether it's therapy or, say, improving your skill set too, whichever way you go about it. In fact, Stephen James of Project Life Mastery has said one of the biggest problems we have with poverty is you need to develop a skill set. Noting I say skill set, not a sheet of paper called a degree. That is supposed to be in lieu of that. So getting then on to virtues. Seems to me virtues are not a short-term desired object, so to speak, to have. But a burrito that is very pleasurable is. And so are cigarettes, which one woman a month ago told me she has used and resents having to use in her life. She calls it a crutch. So, of course, did I mention alcohol, of course. Lottery tickets, lottery machine, game playing, and call it, if you will, the indulgence in sexuality that is purchased, referred to as prostitution. For instance, I read recently in Tucson, Arizona, the number one arrest is for solicitation of prostitution. I suppose maybe in some areas and in some countries that is part of the local gas mart. Now these are all too typically called vices. But what if we have a lot of other vices too that are much more commonly used or very commonly used but not labeled vices, or in general thus short-term expedient things? Noting I have several people I live with in the apartment complex I'm in who used short-term expedient measures earlier in life and are now dying in their 60s of COPD from smoking. Now, there were whistleblowers who went out and spoke up about this after getting many records. Brown and Williamson Company, for instance, was brought up lawsuits against and exposure against. I suppose you could call it in that regard then the pushing too much of cigarettes with ads. Now here's an example from my personal life or two. In terms of this virtue being a slow way to growth, a slow payoff, versus, again, the fast food short-term mentality, or call it the vice approach, if you will. Certain things labeled vices, other things not. I have a relative once who told me 5-10 years ago that one of my greatest strengths is patience. Yet I had only heard that from him maybe 1 time, 2 times in my entire life, except for one other time. I had cell phone problems 3-4 years ago, called the carrier, and a person got on the phone with me, and it took a whole hour to solve the problem. And 20 minutes in, he said, "Can I ask you a personal question?" He said, "Why haven't you blown up at me? Why haven't you gotten angry that we haven't solved this in the 20 minutes so far?" He says, "Most people by now would have blown up at me." He said, "You must have a lot of patience. How is that?" Well, I may have explained this and that, explained and mentioned I wrote some books or such not. My first book was on love. I may have mentioned, too, that my mother was an immigrant from a tiny village, farm village in eastern Poland, that my grandfather was a Mennonite from Odessa, Russia, Ukraine. But note, his comment basically being not just, "Why haven't you blown up at me?" but again, confirmation of what one relative told me maybe just one time, and nobody else in my entire life, now 62. "You have great patience." And if I didn't mention it already, why would Guilford write a book saying mothers, as looking after their children at home, need to be able to advocate their worth, and that if they could quantify it, it would be worth $100,000 minimum, what they provide. I'm not so sure at all that's the major issue. Is it the issue of not being able to quantify what the impact is, or so many of us these days especially wanting short-term at the expense of long-term? We can quantify what the results will be of no sleep when we need sleep, or too much work, or no exercise, or not spending enough quality, i.e. loving time with our children, or, quote, putting them in daycare that is of very low quality and subjecting them to rent-a-parents, basically. Indeed, Grant Cardone, who was once a, quote, drug addict in his early 20s, and brutalized, in fact, in his early 20s too, one day when he was buying drugs. Now, of course, everybody has flaws, and some will come out of the woodwork and attack him on this and that. Yes, he has flaws, but kudos to him for having beaten drugs. But why, in one video, and maybe more than one, would he say part of the problem with people creating a brand, if a content provider, video, writing, what have you, is that they don't want to be seen? And in another video he said part of the problem is basically that people with virtue are ashamed of it. Well, I believe sometimes part of the problem is how the virtue is expressed, such that it is expressed in an angry manner, and hence the person is called a hothead. For instance, if you have not the words to express things respectfully or clearly, you may be called a wingnut, or you may be called a radical, or a loose cannon, or you may be called an instigator of a revolution. Or did I use the word hothead? And why, too, are great geniuses called nerds, unless that genius can help make tons and tons of money? Otherwise, maybe they're called starving artists. Indeed, why is there such emphasis on security rather than what you call love or understanding. So I see people dividing in two camps. Some say, well, the problem is you don't know how to advocate what your strengths are that are intangible. Others say, well, you just don't know your worth. And the third camp may say, though, the real problem is people know what's good for them in the long run, but they want all too often what's pleasurable in the short run. The idea, again, of the psychological test, do you want 2 marshmallows later or 1 marshmallow now? Only I would say it's more a matter, again, of do you want the pot of gold later or a few marshmallows now? So, if virtues such as empathy, call it love if you will, or understanding, if virtues such as patience, if virtues such as tolerance, some of these perhaps talked of in the scriptures of the Christian Bible in 1 Corinthians 13 on love, if virtues as these are not in vogue so often in the short run, but the absence of such bringing nations into decrepitude and non-existence in the long run, then what is so desirable in the short term? Well, perhaps what is desirable in the short term is escape. Perhaps what is desirable in the short term is running from fears, from anger, from misconceptions, from guilt. Through a variety of means, call it drugs, call it blame shifting, call it burying your head in the sand. Call it isolating, if you will. Call it word games. Call it mislabeling. Or when we're talking escapism, when we're talking drugs, call it getting high. So it just occurred to me, why not that I carry on here for a minute or two on the various ways of, quote, getting high or short-term expedient running from problems. This coming again from a West Pointer who part of his training back then in the, 79 through 83 was all the ways in which these various ways of running were not available. For instance, none of us were allowed to have a TV our whole 4 years, no radio the first year. We had no cell phones back then, and you were not allowed to have a phone in your room, wired, so to speak, landline, until your 4th year if you were a club leader, say of this or that organization. You also were not allowed to have a woman in the room without the door open, and no alcohol was permitted in your room ever. You were not allowed to be married. Nobody took, quote, meds of any sort, and so on and so on. And you could not drink alcohol at all unless on a Friday or Saturday night at the local designated points where entertainment was provided. And indeed, only maybe, 10-20% of the populace was female, and that a new change some 3 years before I went. And nobody was allowed to have a car until your last year, and then the parking lot for the cars was a mile away. You had to take a shuttle or walk there. And classes were 6 days a week. You had to do parades and mandatory sports and mandatory sports classes all year round, all 4 years, and mandatory summer jobs all throughout the country or at West Point's facility itself. And if you were caught lying, cheating, or stealing, or tolerating, you were out. And if you became heavy set and you didn't fix the problem or get help, so to speak, to fix it, in 6 months' time you were also out. And every year physical testing, push-ups, pull-ups, a shuttle run or some such, 2-mile run it was. You didn't meet the qualifications, you were also out. And if your room wasn't up to snuff, you were also out. And God forbid, too, if you had sexual encounters of any sort in your room, you were nailed to the wall. And it was in all the local sheets of paper, shall we say, on every bulletin board throughout. And did I mention you were not allowed to be married? In fact, I'll tell you an interesting story or two. My 4th summer at West Point, before 3rd or 4th summer, I had a roommate the first day of our rooming together. He said, I have a problem. I just came back from a 2-year mission from South America as a Mormon, and leave of absence was granted me, and I have a problem. I'm married. I married a woman down there, and I've concealed it. But West Point won't let me continue if they found out. What do I do? Another cadet once came up to me, my 4th year there, and he said, I found a person who has a bottle of wine in their drawer, in their room. What do I do? Well, in these days that would be looked at like, what, is that a big issue? Yet another thing. I had a roommate my first year. He was under considerable stress. Legal issues. What was the legal issue? He had hidden mail under his blotter that he was supposed to deliver from room to room, and under the stress of it being brought up to leadership, he had gone down to the Hudson River, half a mile from his barracks, so to speak, the room, and smoked marijuana, and he was picked up by the military police. When that happened, he was kicked out for a year. But because he was on the wrestling team, he came back a year later and later graduated. There was, too, the cheating scandal with football players. A number of them had been discovered cheating. So at any rate, I may have gotten off track just a bit, but how interesting that we don't try to promote virtues. We don't try to promote conquering of fears like West Point tried to train into us. We don't try to promote morals. Indeed, one man, almost a lone wolf, trying to remember his name, it will come to me in a minute, but he wrote, amongst other things, Wolves in Sheep's Clothing. And he's talked of how character matters, but it has been greatly degraded in our country. And that we have a character crisis, not a neurotic crisis as per Freud's time. Oh yes, the name, Dr. George Simon Jr. And this moral crisis also talked of, for instance, by Chris Hedges, a minister trained, so to speak, from Harvard with an MDiv degree, who spent some 20-odd years until coming back to America as a foreign correspondent in war-torn regions. Now, sadly, though, without respectful words and some humor and a smile, this can be misinterpreted and is wrongly stated oftentimes, I believe. Even Dr. George Simon Jr. urging people to be cautious how they approach speaking about various matters. The same in this vein talked of by a Dr. Romani, again though, from formerly Indian extraction, and interestingly too, by a Native American Cherokee woman lately deceased, Dr. Ann Schaaf, who wrote a fascinating book I bought 2 years ago and read part of, let's see the title, when society becomes an addict. And she wasn't just talking chemical-based addictions. So I'd say in a nutshell, the issue isn't so much at all what's quantifiable or not, but what feels good at the moment. We used to call these, I suppose, if you were religiously oriented, vices or sins. Some would call it, as part of that too, prostitution. Some would call it porn. Some would call it being overindulgent. I would call it pursuit of what feels good at the moment, what's short-term expedient. And often, in turn then, what can be blame shifted as to the long-term results. What can be excused away, or as one rabbi has talked of it, a Jewish rabbi, what can be rationalized after the fact. Or even in the example of Hitler then, what can often be praised in one country one day or one period, and then the next day, lo and behold, called pathological in terms of it being deemed then not a leader but a war criminal. One day one viewpoint, another day another. Short-term expediency till a big meltdown called a world war. So what feels the best? Well, crack cocaine. Very, very addictive. Why? Because it feels so great. It's not so addictive per se. It just feels so great compared to so many other things, including a cup of chamomile tea. So, crack cocaine, I believe, doesn't just get indulged in so much because, it's got addictive qualities, but because it's got such a big bang for the buck that it's preferred over, say, chamomile tea, or a decent night's sleep, or virtues, shall we say. Call it love, whatever you want to call it, or just restraint sometimes, biting your tongue or whatever. Or again, as in my case, being told, you have patience, but only told that twice in your life. So what else is very, very pleasurable in the short term, and thus a very big way of escaping our problems in the short term? If not just then crack. Well, in Kentucky, the epidemics of meth and marijuana. Of course, that throughout the country to various extents. What too, though, of praising so much more one's financial holdings or what one wears? You might call it the Armani suit look, or what one drives, luxury automobiles. For where there's not great virtue, where there's not great inner beauty, don't we put external sources upon what's beautiful in its realm instead? Case in point, if there are very few Lincolns, very few Gandhis, and very few stellar people, very few stellar leaders in general, very few stellar ministers even, don't we then look and praise what we find otherwise? And it's wearing the, quote, Armani suit in a variety of forms, or the Armani suit of what one has in one's billfold. Yes, can't one be wearing an Armani suit in terms of one's, quote, financial worth? In fact, when we say, what's the man worth? We say, this and that dollars. We don't say, his worth is he's patient, or his worth is he's a most impeccably moral person of character. We always say his worth is such and such dollars, at least in this country and at this time. Hasn't always been the case. And I don't then believe it's because necessarily or majorly so that money dollar signs is simply very quantifiable. It shows up on a screen or on a printout, bank book ledger, what have you, as opposed to trying to quantify patience. I think that's barking up the wrong tree entirely now, with more clarity today than I've ever seen before by far. Same goes for being a mother. We know the effects of no mother on a family. And we know the effects all too often of poor parenting if the child was in poor daycare facilities too. We don't say, oh, it was the problem of not being able to quantify it. Likewise, nobody has a problem saying, well, grandmothers can be great mothers in comparison to young, inexperienced and stressed out in many a way 20-year-old mothers. Yet, are we supposed to try and fuss over how to quantify this oftentimes far better upbringing provided by a grandmother? I think it just goes without questioning in this department. In fact, there's even jealousy, if you will, in some circles by those who were raised by a grandmother. And there's no question that wise elderly Indian chiefs are such. What isn't being addressed are the forms of what I call vices, if you were in the religious realm using that word, short-term expedients. We call these things then drugs and the drug problems. Sometimes we went off the deep end too and said, well, zero tolerance policy and let's load up the prisons and for long periods and in overcrowded fashion with what amounts to even now tons and tons of drug offense related incident situations. And then we blame the brain for what we call centers that make us so susceptible to only certain things we call, such as crack cocaine. We say, oh, there's a center in the brain that makes us susceptible to this being so highly desirable. But do we ever say there's a center in the brain that causes us to love to engorge in a Thanksgiving dinner? And that with cheap food and more ways of buying plus clothing and more of it done all the time, that food is not called crack cocaine. To include the proliferation of fast food and even burritos and tacos all over in parking lots everywhere. In fact, if you go to a barrio, so to speak, a Mexican area, in any major urban area, you may find yourself unable to walk without tripping over or running into every 5 feet a burrito setup. I'm joking, of course, but people know what sells and what doesn't sell. Hence the phrase, sex sells. I can tell you too, in my state, marijuana sells, and so does meth, and so do lottery machines, and so do cigarettes by the boatload. And of course, alcohol galore. In fact, I can also tell you from personal experience now at 62, if you are poor, uneducated, so to speak, in the proper sense of the term, and you come to America and you're an immigrant, you either work in the fast food industry or you work in the horse industry and tied to it lots of gambling and lots of alcohol, or you work all too often by opening up an alcohol center, I call a liquor store, or a gas mart, which in turn is a center called a cigarette shop, alcohol shop, lottery machine shop, and who knows what else under the counter shop. In fact, at these places, gas only brings in maybe 2 cents per gallon profit. The rest is from all the other items I've just mentioned. That's not commonly known. So if you're an immigrant, you're poor, quote, uneducated, sometimes illegally operating, you either find yourself gravitating all too easily toward certain, quote, industries that are short-term expedient providing, yet legal. Now, I'm not, of course, advocating an all-or-nothing approach. I'm simply stating what I find to be alternative, not spoken of, forms of what you call, in the past, vices, but today we would call crack cocaine, or drugs, in the conventional sense. We don't call thus engorging on too much cheap, sugar-laden, high-calorie food a form of crack cocaine or short-term expediency. We just call it overindulgence. But what is overindulgence except short-term expediency and excusing it away and providing cheap ways of handling the consequences overall, too? Likewise, some talk of porn, some talk of prostitution, some use the word sexaholism, but how many talk of what comes on major programming channels as to the push on sexuality over the board too? Or if we were to talk a major box store, say in an urban area near me on a Friday night, looking as per the women there, dressed like they were at a disco in the past, half-dressed, shall we say, or as one video put it 10 years ago, clergyman, shall we say, from a Muslim country saying to a British individual, applicable to Americans too, you need to fix your women as to their being half-dressed. Of course, dressed from head to toe is a question too, of course. So many women protest and are bitter about men having affairs. And sometimes we label people as philanderers also. Even presidents sometimes have been termed this term. But do we know even then how to quantify or terminologize the term sexaholism, except to maybe pillory someone like a famous golf pro? And what about aggression and the praise of it even, as sometimes a virtue? We call someone not aggressive a pansy, or we call them gay, or we call them effeminate, or we say, oh, they're not patriotic. Or we say, oh, they're a wimp. And yes, while there is an aspect to caving into our fears as not ideal by any means, don't we praise aggression all too often, especially in certain countries? Maybe America and Britain in particular come to mind. Hence, in Britain, for instance, sometimes at soccer games, riots. And the craze for aggressive sports in America, I will have to say myself. So, to recap and recap, what sells? Well, what sells so often is what's short-term expedient, but especially when the long-term effects are blame shifted away as a genetic problem or some other people's problem, say some foreign country's problem or some foreign leader's problem or some religion's problem. Or, it's the homeless's problem. The problem of choice, shall we say, that shifts and goes from one place to another. The problem isn't, I think, what's not quantifiable in what is, but what gives a great initial bang for the buck. What is a form, thus, of crack cocaine that is not called crack cocaine? And it is all too often just attributed, say, to a brain center region. Well, maybe there is a brain center region, but it doesn't have to be indulged upon. It doesn't have to be praised. It doesn't have to be on the screen. And it doesn't have to be called a virtue. And it doesn't have to be called as it is only because it's quantifiable. For yes, when you go to a football game or a basketball game, or you even tune in, say, or go to a baseball game, yes, there are statistics and there are people crazed on keeping statistics, and it is massively quantifiable. It's also quantifiable how much money you have in a bank account or in your wallet, because the tools for quantifying it are the digits 1 through 9, for instance, and a printout and detailed records kept. But to say that the problem is that there's no terminology or no digits, so to speak, to quantify matters, or that we haven't spent enough time record keeping and promoting it through means of advocating, I think is begging the question. So what sells are the short-term pleasure center driven, perhaps there is something to that, matters that have evolved. Engorgement on food being one of them. Sex, money, as to what it might buy you sometimes. And did I say aggression? Hence, you might say in certain circles too, what sells is football, basketball, and so on. That even humorously stated by Bette Midler, I think, in the movie, what was it? Fried Green Tomatoes. Hence, once when I had some anger issues galore, 10 years ago or more, somebody telling me as advice, get a pillow and punch it. And so, in other words, indulge in this short-term expedient use of aggression. Well, that's not going to get to the bottom of the issue. I got to the bottom of the issue by keeping an anger journal and noting all instances of anger and what was the overlying concepts involved. Call it cognitive therapy, if you will. But not by simply displacing this aggression. So yes, sex sells. Aggression sells galore. Just look at both of these on what we spend money on and what is so heavily advertised in what is in movies and sitcoms and more. And what is in your malls today, too, on a Friday night all too often, or certain box stores. Isn't that then, too, why certain television programs were so popular in America, and maybe in Britain for that matter? Sex in the City. You might say also aggression in the country, of certain countries. Yes, sex sells. Aggression sells. Engorgement on high-calorie food and quick also sells. If it isn't delivered quick, oh my goodness. To put the food situation another way, indulging in the short-term expedient escape measure of a Thanksgiving meal in a tiny cardboard box delivered within 1 minute. And very cheaply, too. And repeatable on a daily basis, perhaps. And paid for by credit cards, if not called fast food, but a restaurant meal. Upon which at a certain point one simply declares bankruptcy and does it all over again, rinse and repeat. And of course, how can we say, oh, it's just thus a problem of crack cocaine, or it's just now a fentanyl problem, or it's just a heroin problem, or it's just a drug problem. Maybe all of these things are drugs. Isn't that then why Anne Schaef, late Anne Schaef, a former therapist, PhD level, Cherokee Indian, had written a book, amongst others, entitled When Society Becomes an Addict? Maybe the problem isn't just addictions and its short-term expediency, but it not being labeled properly. Maybe there are too many ways of being an addict in terms of being short-term expedient-oriented and running from our problems thus. By way of not just the running part, but of how we justify the after effects. Call it collateral damage, if you will, on a huge scale. Rationalization, again, as that one rabbi talked of, excuse-making or blame-shifting, some others might call it, even to the extent then of saying, oh, it's just their genetics. Or alternatively, interestingly, as one person, a relative, once told me that so-and-so's great strengths were also because of genetics, lucky genetics in this case, not bad genetics. A new twist on things. To blame someone else's genetics in the positive sense for that person's progress and not our own. As opposed to learning and patience and not doing something, quote, dumb. So isn't this then why we don't get compliments in certain areas, but other people do get compliments? Women all too often get compliments for their beauty. They get compliments for their beauty because of the associated sexuality aspect, I believe, in turn. It's not just, oh, you're beautiful, but, oh, I'd sure love to hop in bed with you sometime soon, associated with it. And it's not just, oh, a great football player, rah-rah. It's, a great football player because he looks sexy and often is acting the part, too, in real life. And he has the potential to be very aggressive, and we value aggression all too often as short-term expedient. Like going and getting that pillow approach. Punch the pillow, don't solve the problem in the long term. Let alone is there a quick solution to do so as to solving that. I like, again, that little ditty I heard. That word, heard it more than one time by one rabbi on YouTube. I wish I knew the name of him off the top of my head. He used the term rationalizations. Others would call it excuse-making or dodging responsibility, not that anything is one person's sole problem as to causation. Others would call it passing the buck. And what greater way, again, of passing the buck than to say, oh, it's somebody else's problem, not ever mine, or it's just one person's problem, or it's some country's problem, or it's the homeless's problem, it's the poor people's problem, it's this and that only problem, or it was by choice. All thoughts here that I've had and clarified to an extent now, I think, to about the degree I can, of why having, quote, virtuous aspects, empathy, patience, long-term beneficial aspects to yourself, your family, children included, your nation, your world, don't ever even reach the radar screen, and we seek validation on these. A woman never has to seek validation unless from a bad childhood situation on her beauty, because she doesn't have to seek the validation of what often goes with it, the sexual component that can be offered. Likewise for a football player, sexual component that can be offered all too easily and frequently, and the aggressive component too. a humorous note to end all of this. We go to stadiums to watch football, aggressive, and in Britain, soccer, and sometimes riots breaking out. We like, too, aggressive basketball. Baseball, I'm not so sure that's as popular by far. Maybe if baseball were more aggressive, and we routinely saw as part of the game you take the baseball bat and beat the other person to a pulp with a baseball bat, maybe the statistics as to numbers of people going would increase. Wrestling likely, and boxing too, very popular at one time. Even then the Rocky shows, some 5 or more. But what isn't so popular? What don't you go to a stadium and watch in mass numbers and pay a lot of money for? A golf pro. Now, what about a chess competition in a stadium watched by 50,000 people? The level of skill, impressive. Grandmaster, they call it. But we don't go to a stadium and watch someone play between two great chess masters or golf. If visually watching it weren't the problem in and of itself, you can put cameras and blow that thing up on screens. We don't watch golf in a stadium and pay lots of money, by the way, too, on a large-scale level, or chess. Why? Because it's not short-term expedient to us. It doesn't reach something that gives us a huge bang for the buck. Neither do the virtues. And so as time goes on, if we can't get validation that we have something wonderful in the long-term sense, and we have people telling us, oh, it's just because it isn't quantifiable, we can get quite confused, I think, as to what's up and what's down. And then, in turn, the whole nation can grind to a halt, or just be invaded upon, or nixed out, superseded, if you will. Time for wake-up calls, isn't it?